Hello, Professor Brian Bogus here. Going to talk about bureaucracies and bureaucrats this week in political economy. I wanted to just give you a little introductory video about these things. Some of you have written and touched on these issues already in some of your assignments, but we're going to spend more detail and look at them in more uh, in depth this week. So, anyway, um, bureaucracies themselves are not necessarily bad. They contribute to the continuation of government. They've also continued to the contribute to the professionalization of government. The civil service and the bureaucracies of the ancient medieval times, helped keep the governments running during transitions of monarchs. Sometimes the monarchies were not so peaceful transitions, but things still need to get done. Treaties made and civil services delivered and so forth, and the bureaucracy was an important part of that. In American times, the bureaucracy has contributed to the more professionalization of the government. A lot of nepotism and cronyism going on in earlier days where relatives and cousins and nephews of elected officials all got the jobs. And, that was not always leading to the most efficient outcomes for the public. And so there was a drive to eliminate some of that, and that was to professionalize the civil service, which made a more um, uh, less cronyistic, nepotistic civil service where you could hire people based upon qualifications and education experience. Having said all that, the bureaucracy has some very positive contributions to make. The purpose of the bureaucracy, of course, is to turn policy decisions and policy actions into tangible, deliverable goods and services. And so that is another important part. Your congressmen do not turn their votes on budget deals and legislation into action. That is the job of the bureaucracy to which the power has been granted to make that happen. But the bureaucracy, of course, is populated and staffed by bureaucrats who are very interested in their own self interest, like everybody else in both the markets and in the government. And so we need to take a look at how the bureaucracies work, and in some cases, how they may not work so well. You're going to read an article that's going to look at the bureaucracies as budget maximizers. There's basically two ways a bureaucracy can grow in power and authority, and that is to acquire more money, and the other one is to acquire a larger portfolio, to be more responsible for more activities. Since the bureaucracy is not subject to market discipline of profit and prices, it is subject to political discipline of budgets and power authority. And so the way that a bureaucrat can affirm that they have done a decent job is by an increase in budget or by a expansion of their authority. Now, interestingly enough, sometimes the bureaucrat will actually use the inadequate delivery of services is also an excuse for an expansion of budget. So a bureaucrat can go to the legislative budget authorities and say, hey, we've done a really good job, you should give us more budget. Or they can go to the legislative budget authorities and say, hey, we weren't able to complete our mission this past quarter or past year because we didn't have enough budget. So either way, no matter what happens, the incentive for the bureaucrat is to talk about how they need more budget. And so that's one of the things that this article will discuss, and one of the things we need to think about when we analyze bureaucracies in a more real world economic sense as opposed to our hopeful aspirational sense. The other thing that we need to think about when we think about agencies and bureaucracies is that they are often staffed and run by people from the industries for which they are regulating. For instance, the doctors board in most states, composed of 12 to 15 members. It is responsible for administering the license that potential doctor has to pass in order to become a professional member of the society and allowed to practice for money in the state. Um, in Maryland, a state which I've actually had some personal experience with this because I worked in the state government for a while, it's called the Board of Physicians Quality Assurance, BPQA. Every state has some equivalent, even if it's called something different. Most of the members on the BPQA were doctors. So we have this situation where current doctors are primarily the ones responsible for licensing potentially new doctors. That may make sense. Being a doctor is complicated and complex, requires lots of education and experience and so forth, and maybe folks like you and me might not be qualified to sit in judgment of a doctor's abilities. On the other hand, it also has the effect, and we need to recognize this, regardless of whether we think this process is proper or not, we need to recognize the fact that this also has the effect of eliminating or reducing the number of doctors that are actually going to be allowed to practice. And that has the effect of increasing the prices that doctors can charge. Less supply, same demand, more money for the supplier. So we call this the capture theory when the agency that is in charge of regulating an industry, whether it be doctors or lawyers or hair cutters, most states require barbers and beauticians to be licensed, or home improvement guys, or landscape architects, or those who are nurses or practice the masseuse and massaging. All of those professions and many, many, many more need to be licensed in most states. And all of those are work just like the doctor's board that I just described. They are primarily made up of practicing licensed members of the profession who sit in judgment of whether new people are allowed to become licensed practitioners as well. This is a way for the industry to get a cartel, something that they could not do legally on their own, but through the power of the legislature and the regulatory board, they are able to accomplish. It keeps people out of their business and allows them to charge higher prices than they would otherwise be able to do. And that is something that we need to keep in mind. Regardless of whether we think this is an essential function or not, we need to also understand the effects that this practice has. So, as we go forward, you can think about the things that a bureaucracy does, professionalizes things, keeps a continuation of government during transition periods and other times. But we also need to think about the cost and we analyze whether the benefits of that continuation and professionalization is worth the cost of higher prices for a lot of services that we pay for, as well as, of course, the outright fact that they are users and spenders of a significant amount of taxpayers' money. So, as you read and as you look at the material this week, one item of which is something that I wrote with a co-author about how something called sunset legislation works and how that's also a tug of war between the legislature and the executive as they use the bureaucracy to try to implement their preferred policies. And if the executive and the legislature are at odds with each other, it becomes a bit of a budget battle. You'll look at all this stuff this week. Keep in mind that it's all about budget and power and who's going to have the authority to spend and who's going to have the authority to regulate the economy. Have a good week. Talk to you again soon.